Every government tells its people the same story. Debt is temporary. Borrowing is necessary. Growth will fix everything. Good. And yet, here's the mystery no one explains. Why do almost all nations remain in debt forever? No matter who's in power, no matter which ideology they claim, no matter how many reforms they announce, why do countries pay trillions in interest and still owe more than before? And most disturbing of all, why does the global financial system collapse the moment a nation even tries to escape debt? This isn't incompetence, it isn't bad luck, and it isn't coincidence. It's the result of a silent agreement, unspoken, unsigned, but strictly enforced, that keeps nations permanently indebted. To understand it, we need to rewind history and follow the debt where it actually leads. Debt didn't always dominate nations. For much of history, rulers borrowed sparingly. Debt was dangerous. It meant weakness. The king couldn't repay, creditors could demand land, resources, or political control. But everything changed with the rise of central banking and modern state financing. In the late 17th century, institutions like the Bank of England introduced a revolutionary idea. Governments could borrow continuously, not to repay fully, but to roll debt forward indefinitely. This was the birth of national debt as a permanent feature, not a temporary emergency tool. Key figures didn't hide this shift. Economists, bankers, and policymakers openly discussed how debt could stabilize governments, as long as confidence never broke. Debt wasn't a burden anymore. It became leverage. The real foundation of permanent national debt was laid through three mechanisms. First, fractional reserve banking. Banks were allowed to lend money they didn't fully possess. Governments adopted the same logic. Debt expanded faster than real economic output. Second, fiat currency. Once money was no longer tied to gold or hard assets, governments could borrow in their own currency indefinitely. But that came with a catch. The value of money had to slowly erode. Third, interest-based sovereign debt. Governments didn't just borrow money, they borrowed it at interest, compounding over decades. This mathematically guaranteed that debt would grow faster than repayment. From the start, the system wasn't designed for debt elimination. It was designed for debt management. After World War II, the system went global. Institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and later global bond markets standardized how nations borrow, spend, and repay. Countries were told, borrow to develop, borrow to stabilize, borrow to modernize, and when crises hit, borrow more. But here's the twist most people miss. These institutions didn't just lend money. They enforced rules. Rules about spending, rules about interest payments, rules about currency policy, rules about austerity. Once a country entered this system, exiting became nearly impossible without severe consequences. Debt turned into discipline. So what is the silent agreement? Simple, but brutal. Nations may exist, govern, and grow, as long as they remain solvent to creditors. The moment a country threatens that balance by defaulting, restructuring too aggressively, or rejecting debt, markets react instantly. Currencies collapse, capital flees, sanctions appear, credit dries up. No alignment is required, no invasion necessary. Debt becomes the enforcement mechanism. And every nation knows this, which is why they comply without being told. Every few decades, the system reaches a breaking point. The symptoms are always the same: exploding deficits, rising interest payments, currency pressure, social unrest from Latin America in the 1980s to Asia in the 1990s. To Europe after 2008, the story repeats. Countries are told they've mismanaged finances, but the pattern is global, not local. The real issue isn't spending. It's structural dependency. Debt grows faster than economies. Interest compounds. Growth slows. And eventually, the math stops working. When nations struggle with debt, governments don't default easily. They adjust. And those adjustments always hit the same groups: reduced public services, higher taxes, pension cuts, currency devaluation. The debt remains. The burden shifts downward. Citizens pay not because they caused the debt, but because the system requires someone to absorb the cost. Meanwhile, creditors are protected, bonds are honored, markets are reassured. The agreement holds. Every crisis brings promises of reform: balanced budgets, debt ceilings, fiscal responsibility. But these fixes never touch the core problem. Why? Because governments cannot eliminate debt without destabilizing the system that finances them. Paying off debt shrinks money supply. Shrinking money supply causes recessions. Recessions reduce tax revenue, which forces more borrowing. It's a loop. Even surplus countries are trapped because global trade and finance require someone else to be in deficit. Debt isn't a failure of the system, it is the system. Today, global debt has reached historic levels. Government debt, corporate debt, household debt, all rising together. Despite record borrowing, growth remains fragile. Central banks promise stability while quietly admitting they cannot allow debt deflation. Interest rates rise, markets panic, rates fall, bubbles form. There is no safe exit. And the same nations that preach responsibility continue borrowing more every year. The agreement has become global, synchronized, and permanent. So why doesn't any nation break the deal? Because the cost of leaving is immediate, while the cost of staying is delayed. Political systems reward short-term stability over long-term truth. Leaders come and go. Debt remains. And as long as currencies hold and markets function, the agreement survives. Silently, efficiently, invisibly. What should you understand from all this? National debt is not meant to be eliminated. It's meant to be sustained. Debt enforces global discipline without force, through markets, confidence, and currency pressure. Crises don't break the system, they reinforce it by justifying more borrowing. When debt becomes permanent, democracy becomes constrained by creditors. And here's the open-ended thought. If no nation can truly escape debt, who is the system actually built to serve? If this changed how you see governments, debt, and global power, subscribe, because the next story explains what happens when the agreement finally breaks.